Welcome everybody to the second chapter. In this chapter, we would like to talk a little bit more about the important macroeconomic variables. We would like to define GDP, the inflation rate, and the unemployment rate. So we'll talk in detail about these three different macroeconomic variables, and we will also introduce different methods how to measure the one or the other variable. The learning goals are as follows. Like after you have worked through this chapter, you should be able to name and apply different definitions of GDP. You should explain why GDP is not a perfect measure of economic activity. You should know the differences between nominal and real variables, as well as level and growth variables. Furthermore, you should know what kind of problems could arise in case that you measure inflation or that you measure unemployment. Let's start with the GDP variable, and let's talk about GDP per capita. In this table, you can see that the GDP per capita in Germany is lower than the GDP per capita in the US. In Germany, it is about $30,000 US, and the US, it's about $42,000 US. One big question is, why is it the case that the GDP is higher in the US? And of course, in the first step, one could think about productivity. But when you look at the other rows of this table, you can see here one measure productivity, like the GDP measured in US dollar, which is created in one working hour. And when you look at the values, it's a case that more or less it's the same. It's $48 in Germany and $48 in the US. So there are not such big differences in productivity. Then when you look at the other rows, you can see here the working hours of each employee, like the hours worked per year. And here you can see a big difference, like 1,440 hours in Germany and 1,820 hours in the US. So the Americans, they are working more hours, and thereby they are creating a higher GDP per capita. So the Americans, they don't have 6 weeks of holiday, they only have 1 or 2. And this makes, in the end, the big difference in GDP per capita. Hence, GDP per capita, like what does it mean at all? Is it a voluntary decision to have a low GDP per capita, like for example in Germany? And maybe it's a case that the Germans, they have higher preferences for leisure compared to consumption. So maybe GDP per capita is not telling the full story when it comes to the well-being of a society. The GDP is only an imperfect indicator of the well-being of a society. There are some market distortions because it might be the case that there is involuntary unemployment, that the unemployment rate is high, and hence it is the case that the GDP per capita is lower. Furthermore, all activities without market prices, they are not fully recorded. Let's also give one example for this last relationship. Let's think about that there is a kindergarten kid, and this kid has birthday, and then in the US it would be the case that the mom or dad would drive to a supermarket and would buy a chocolate cake. How does that look like in Germany? In Germany, the parents would drive to a supermarket and they would just buy the ingredients. They want to create the cake by themselves. So they spend a lot of hours in the kitchen, and at the end of the day, the cake is ready and the kid can have a chocolate cake with him in the kindergarten. So in both societies, it's a case that a chocolate cake is created, and in both societies the kid is happy. But in the US, this is a market transaction because the chocolate cake is bought at a baker in a supermarket, but in Germany it's a case that this cake was created in a kitchen, and hence this is not a market transaction and it does not influence the GDP. However, the well-being of the society is the same despite the fact that the GDP will be higher in the US compared to Germany. So it seems to be the case that the GDP is only an imperfect indicator of the well-being of the society, and this is also mentioned in one video which I would like to show right now. It's the video of a Kennedy speech. We will have a look at the video right now, and the transcript is given on slide number 7.
Too much and for too long, we seem to have surrendered personal excellence and community values in the mere accumulation of material things. Our gross national product now is over $800 billion a year. But that gross national product, if we judge the United States of America by that gross national product counts air pollution and cigarette advertising and ambulances to clear our highways of carnage. It counts special locks for our doors and the jails for the people who break them. It counts the destruction of the redwoods and the loss of our natural wonders in chaotic sprawl. It counts napalm, and it counts nuclear warheads and armored cars for the police to fight the riots in our cities. It counts Whitman's rifles and sex knives and the television programs which glorify violence in order to sell toys to our children. Yet the gross national product does not allow for the health of our children, the quality of their education, or the joy of their play. It does not include the beauty of our poetry, or the strength of our marriages, the intelligence of our public debate, or the integrity of our public officials. It measures neither our wit nor our courage, neither our wisdom nor our learning, neither our compassion nor our devotion to our country. It measures everything in short, except that which makes life worthwhile. And it can tell us everything about America, except why we are proud that we are Americans.
Well, in the Kennedy video, we saw like a lot of different examples why the GDP is only an imperfect indicator of the well-being of a society. So Kennedy seems to be pretty pessimistic when it comes to whether we should measure the well-being of a society by using GDP. Hans Rosling, he's a little bit more optimistic. He gives some good arguments why it is a good idea to use GDP as a measure of the well-being of a society, because it is correlated with a lot of other variables. For example, GDP is positively correlated with life expectancy. Let's also have a look at his arguments.
Visualization is right at the heart of my own work too. I teach global health. And I know having the data is not enough. I have to show it in ways people both enjoy and understand. Now, I'm going to try something I've never done before. Animating the data in real space, with a bit of technical assistance from the crew.
So, here we go. First, an axis for health. Life expectancy, from 25 years to 75 years. And down here, an axis for wealth, income per person, $400,000, $4,000, and $40,000. So down here is poor and sick, and up here is rich and healthy. Now, I'm going to show you the world 200 years ago in 1810. Here come all the countries. Europe brown, Asia red, Middle East green, Africa south of Sahara blue, and the Americas yellow. And the size of the country bubbles show the size of the population. And in 1810, it was pretty crowded down there, wasn't it? All countries were sick and poor. Life expectancy were below 40 in all countries. And only UK and the Netherlands were slightly better off, but not much. And now, why start the world? The Industrial Revolution makes countries in Europe and elsewhere move away from the rest. But the colonized countries in Asia and Africa, they are stuck down there. And eventually, the Western countries get healthier and healthier. And now we slow down to show the impact of the First World War and the Spanish flu epidemic. What a catastrophe! And now I speed up through the 1920s and the 1930s. And in spite of the Great Depression, Western countries forge on towards greater wealth and health. Japan and some others try to follow, but most countries stay down here. Now, after the tragedies of the Second World War, we stop a bit to look at the world in 1948. 1948 was a great year. The war was over, Sweden topped the medal table at the Winter Olympics, and I was born. But the differences between the countries of the world was wider than ever. United States was in the front, Japan was catching up. Brazil was way behind, Iran was getting a little richer from oil, but still had short lives. And the Asian giants, China, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh and Indonesia, they were still poor and sick down here. But look what is about to happen. Here we go again. In my lifetime, former colonies gained independence, and then finally they started to get healthier and healthier and healthier. And in the 1970s, then countries in Asia and Latin America started to catch up with the Western countries. They became the emerging economies. Some in Africa follows. Some Africans were stuck in civil war and others hit by HIV. And now we can see the world today in the most up-to-date statistics. Most people today live in the middle, but there are huge differences at the same time between the best of countries and the worst of countries. And there are also huge inequalities within countries. These bubbles show country averages, but I can split them. Take China, I can split it into provinces. There goes Shanghai. It has the same wealth and health as Italy today. And there is the poor inland province Guizhou. It is like Pakistan. And if I split it further, the rural parts are like Ghana in Africa.
And yet, despite the enormous disparities today, we have seen 200 years of remarkable progress. That huge historical gap between the West and the rest is now closing. We have become an entirely new converging world. And I see a clear trend into the future. With aid, trade, green technology and peace, it's fully possible that everyone can make it to the healthy, wealthy corner.
Well, what you just seen in the last few minutes is a story of 200 countries shown over 200 years and beyond. It involved plotting of 120,000 numbers. Pretty neat, huh?
So Hans Rosling, he's a little bit more optimistic whether we should use GDP as a measure of the well-being of the society. We will follow his line of argumentation. Nevertheless, we will also keep in mind that there are some imperfections in this measure. So let's try to define GDP. GDP is a measure of the aggregate economic production. If you want to, you can regard it as the amounting of goods and services produced within one economy within 1 year. But we have more precise definitions of the GDP, and there is a so-called production approach, and there we have two definitions. Definition number one is GDP is the sum of the value of the final goods and services which are produced in one economy in a given period like in a year. Second definition, GDP is also the sum of the value added on each layer of the economy. Let's have a look at the income approach. GDP is also the sum of incomes in the economy received during a given period. And the last definition is the consumption of GDP method, like aggregate demand of goods from the different sectors of the economy. So overall, there are like 4 methods which can be used to calculate the GDP or to split up the GDP. When we look at these formal definitions, more or less it's impossible to distinguish the one or the other definition. So I think it's a very good idea to have a look at a numerical example, and then we will try to fill these kind of definitions with a numerical example. So we are looking at one economy. There is one firm which is called like the steel company, which is producing steel. And the steel is sold to the automotive company, which is producing cars. And this is firm number 2. So we have different layers of our economy. This is layer 1, this is layer 2. In the steel company, there are 100 units of sales. So the revenues to the steel company is equal to 100. Then the cost, wages, is equal to 80. And the profit within this company is equal to 20. The steel is completely sold to the automotive company, so intermediate products, they pop up with a negative sign here in the automotive balance sheet because of the fact that this is a steel which stems from the steel company. The revenues, the sales in the automotive company are equal to 210, the wages are equal to 70, so this is the intermediate material, steel 100, and the profit is equal to 40. The cars are bought by private consumers 150, companies 20 as investment goods. The government is using 30 cars as police cars, and foreign countries are also importing some cars from the domestic economy. Let's have a look at the first definition, production approach 1. GDP is the sum of the value of the final goods and services in the economy during a given period. What is very important is to highlight this word here, final goods. Only cars serve final consumption. Only cars are final goods. Therefore, we only have to check the sales, like the revenues in the automotive industry, and the revenues are equal to 210, and therefore the GDP, according to this definition, is equal to 210. Let's have a look at definition number 2. GDP is the sum of the value added on each layer of the economy. Hence, in the first step, we have to compute the value added on each layer. We have to compute the production value at each stage of the value chain. And the value added is computed in the following way: value of production minus value of intermediates. In the steel company, this is very easy because the value of production, like the sales, are equal to 100. The value of intermediates is by assumption equal to 0, so the value added is equal to 100. Automotive, like the value of production, the sales are equal to 210. The intermediates, the steel, has a value of 100, so the value added is only 110. When you now sum up the value added on each stage of the production chain, then it is the case that you get also a GDP of 210. Let's have a look at the income approach. GDP is the sum of the incomes in the economy during a given time period. So we have to sum up the wages in the steel company and the automotive company, which is equal to 150. And then we also have to add up profits. Profits in the steel company are equal to 20 and in the automotive company are equal to 40. So that the sum of profits is equal to 60. And then when we sum up, we also get here the information that the GDP, according to this income approach, is equal to 210. This definition is sometimes a little bit problematic for students. When they talk about income, they only think about wages because this seems to be the major source of income for students. But profits is also a source of income because of the fact that this is the income for the factor capital. We should not only look at the income from the factor labor, we should also consider the income generated by the factor capital. So this is very important. Income is income from wages and in form of dividends and interest for the factor capital. The fourth definition, GDP corresponds to the value of all expenditures, like the aggregate demand of goods from the different sectors of the economy. Here we have to think about who is buying this stuff, and it is a case that private households are consuming, private companies are investing, the government is using the cars as government spending, and then some foreigners are buying the cars. Net exports is equal to 10. When once more we sum up, we also get here the information that the GDP is equal to 210. So we have talked about these four different methods how to define GDP. In the next step, I would like to talk about the difference between real and nominal GDP. We also have here a numerical example. So like over time, we are producing those amount of cars. The car price fluctuates over time. When you multiply through the number of cars produced times the car price, you get here in the last column the nominal GDP. What about real GDP? In a first step, we have to define a base year. And the base year here is a year 2000. What does it imply? We have to keep the price of the year 2000 constant, which is equal to 20,000 euros. Then we once more multiply through the number of cars produced within 1 year times the car price in the base year, and hence we get here the real GDP 10 times 20, which is equal to 20,000. 12 times 20, it's equal to 240,000. So the real GDP is computed by keeping the prices constant. When you look at the nominal GDP, then you can see here in this column that nominal GDP increases by 44% from the year 2000 to the year 2001. Why is that? Like 44%, they stem from an increase in quantity produced by 20%. The car price also increased by 20%. And the remaining 4%, they stem from a combined quantity and price effect. More cars are sold at a higher price. So nominal GDP increases because production is up and because of prices are up. Real GDP instead only increases because the number of production is up, because the prices are kept constant. The increase in real GDP is 20% due to the fact that the number of cars increased by 20%. This is already the end of the first part of this lecture. Have a nice day. Bye bye.